Good morning. We're about to begin the first session on the history of occupational medicine. So those of you in the corridor, please make your way inside. Plenty of seating. And we will begin in a moment with the introduction of the first speaker. The history of occupational medicine, I think, is very important for us to understand. It's important on many levels. It's important because without knowing where we came from, it's very hard to know where we're going and how we came to be the way we are. It is also extremely important in terms of resolving disputes because periodically occupational medicine finds itself faced with various allegations or various insinuations, and in fact the facts are critical to resolving such things without rancor and without guesswork. It is also terribly important for us to learn from our history. We have not always had a peaches and cream in the field of occupational medicine, and we can learn from our mistakes and we can learn from the pressures and the problems that were imposed upon us. So it looks like we have a complete audience now. So let's begin with the introduction of the first speaker, Bob McClellan. And first I'd like to introduce our Avery Stanley, who a resident in occupational medicine, who's going to be doing our introductions. He's Bob's first.
Oh, just kidding.
It's Dr. McClellan.
I didn't realize that. So just do one.
Yes, just the one.
All right. So Dr. Robert McClellan is Medical Director of Dartmouth-Hitchcock's Live Well, Work Well program, which is a comprehensive integrated health promotion, disease management, and health protection program for a population of about 15,000 employees and their families. He serves as Chief of the Section of Occupational and Environmental Medicine of Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center and is Associate Professor of Medicine, Community and Family Medicine, and the Dartmouth Institute at Dartmouth Medical School. He is a past president of the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, as well as the New England College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. Dr. McClellan.
My dear friends, to that lovely introduction, I shall add only one point. My name is Bernardino. As I think about putting together this presentation for you this morning, I realized that you had made less progress than you had thought, which is why I named my talk Back to the Future. I said not so long ago, 'tis a sordid profit that's accompanied by the destruction of health. And indeed, as we look at the history of occupational medicine, it has evolved over time with the evolution of industry and technology. And what is fascinating to me is that as the science of occupational medicine has progressed, the practice and policies associated with your profession have lagged decades, centuries, and even in some cases millennia behind what we knew back in our time. I have nothing to disclose under this robe. Work began a long time ago. Early workplaces and occupational hazards date back thousands of years before the Common Era. But as we evolved from gatherers to hunting food, we began to create workforces to hunt down the mastodon. And this increased our physical hazards. We began to create tools that transitioned from stone to metals. And as we began to use these metals and go through the ages, we began to mine, began to manufacture tools that exposed us to new hazards. Military medicine was really the progenitor of occupational medicine, where warfare, as I'm sad to say, is still practiced today, created the first well-organized workforces. Personal protective equipment were made by themselves for archers in the late Paleolithic period, with finger tubes and wrist guards. And physicians were assigned to military units. The earliest occupational medicine were neurosurgery and orthopedics, assigned to massive construction projects and military work associated with traumatic injury. Edwin Smith discovered and translated the surgical papyrus, which dates back to at least the 1700 before the Common Era, and these were copies of texts that were actually written 400 to 500 years before. I understand these days you have learned what Hippocrates knew 2,000 years ago, and that is environmental. The environment is also important for your health. And indeed, the Romans knew this and had great environmental engineers who created the cloaca maxima to take waste, human waste, away from the city, and aqueducts to bring clean and potable water into the city. Of interest to me today in Michigan is that the Romans knew that ceramic pipes were preferred to lead pipes because of the known adverse effects of lead on miners. Hippocrates, my dear friend, wrote a treatise on airs, waters, and places around 400 before the Common Era. And he said, he implored his medical students, and I would hope that you would learn this lesson, that whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. Consider the seasons, the winds, the hot and the cold, the qualities of the water, the situation of the city, the winds, the waters, the ground, the mode in which the inhabitants live. I understand that you have learned that lifestyle is indeed important to one's health. The pursuits, the hobbies, whether they drink and eat to excess, whether they are given to indolence or are fond of exercise and labor. Hippocrates also wrote about the workplace. He wrote of the appalling work conditions that miners, metal workers, dye makers, tailors, horsemen, and farm workers had to toil within. He talked about work-associated diseases, the horsemen who developed sciatica, impotence, and sterility, the farmers who had fever and mental derangements, the metal workers who were found to breathe heavily, the miners who suffered from lead poisoning. Now, of interest, and it should be of interest to you today too, these common laborers were not considered real citizens. And therefore, although he wrote of this, and the physicians of that time knew of it, they did not really care for the workers. They were disposable. Pliny the Elder brings us to the Common Era, the 1st century. He was a Roman senator, a writer, and scientist. He recognized hazards associated with zinc, lead, and sulfur, and recommended respiratory protection for miners, fashioned a mask from an animal bladder. And then there was Galen. And Galen, in the 2nd century, was a physician to the gladiators. I understand you have such programs on television today and are just learning about some of the trauma that can occur to these individuals. We knew about this. And Galen wrote detailed descriptions of surgical treatment of work-related trauma. He described the hazards associated with acid mists in copper mining and wrote about the pathology of lead poisoning. And then there was Ulrich Ellenborg, a German in the 15th century who really wrote the first treatise on industrial hygiene, talking about the occupational hazards of goldsmiths and metal workers and how to protect them. He wrote of the toxicity of carbon monoxide, lead, mercury, and nitric acid. He talked about approaches that one could take to avoid mercury and lead poisoning, such as using ventilation and using personal protective equipment to cover the mouth with a cloth. And then Paracelsus, who lived between 1493 and 1541, who was an army surgeon, the father of toxicology, who said, "All substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison. The right dose is what differentiates a poison and remedy." His most interest, however, was in pharmacotherapy, and he experimented with heavy metals as treatments and was the first to use mercury as a treatment for syphilis. He wrote also of diseases of the miners, phthisis and other diseases, and of the shortness of breath and cachexia under which they suffered. Georgius Bauer, better known to you these days as Agricola, lived around the same time and wrote De Re Metallica, 12 detailed books on all aspects of mining, smelting, and refining, which I commend to you today, for he understood the physical, chemical, and biological hazards, the importance of ventilation in mines, ergonomics and mechanical lifts, the use of the Glotz bladder as a respirator, the fact that shift work, in fact, needed to be managed in order to protect the workers, and he discovered that butter, which as we know today contains calcium, was an excellent antidote to help prevent the absorption of lead toxicity, made available, however, only to the foreman of the mines and not to the common worker. Safety first indeed. We should always devote, he said, more care to maintaining our health than we may freely perform our bodily functions than to making profits. Have you learned that yet, my friends? He wrote of personal protective equipment, boots of rawhide, gloves long enough to reach to the elbow, and they should fasten loose veils over their faces. The dust will then neither be drawn through these into their windpipes and lungs, nor will it fly into their eyes. He wrote of engineering controls as the foundation of the hierarchy of controls. I will now speak of ventilating machines. If air does not replenish itself, it weighs heavily on the miners, causing them to breathe with difficulty, and sometimes they are even suffocated, and burning lamps are also extinguished. An experience I understand you continue to have to this day. He wrote of dust as a potential causative agent. The dust penetrates into the windpipe and lungs and produces difficulty in breathing and the disease, which the Greeks called asthma. If the dust has corrosive qualities, it eats away the lungs and implants consumption in the body. And then there was Samuel Stockhausen, a German who lived in the 17th century, who wrote a treatise on the noxious fumes of litharge, diseases caused by them and miners' asthma. He attributed miners' disease, known to Romans as morbi metallicae, to litharge, a natural mineral form of lead. And he wrote of the importance of prevention to avoid aspiration of these dusts. And yes, Bernardino, myself, I lived in the 17th up into the early 18th century, and I did improve upon Hippocrates' great foundation for the science of medicine to the questions recommended by Hippocrates. I suggested he ask one more. What is your occupation? I learned this is still a lesson that needs to be taught in medical school today. I wrote The Diseases of Worker and published it first in 1700. A second edition in 1713, I added 12 more chapters. I also produced and published the first Palm Pilot. It was 18 centimeters tall, and it was meant as a pocketbook for physicians. It was lost, unfortunately, after 100 to 200 years of frequent citation. It was lost. But then a Professor Wright translated it again from the original Latin in 1940 and raised interest in the English-speaking world. I wrote of the workplace visit, of first-hand descriptions of 52 occupations and associated diseases and injuries. I wrote of chemicals, dust, metals, repetitive or violent motions, odd postures, and other disease-causative agents. I wrote of toxic hazards, and I said the first and most potent is the harmful character of the materials that they handle. For these emit noxious vapors and very fine particles, which you know today as PM 2.5. We talked about them as fine particles inimical to human beings and induce particular diseases. I wrote of ergonomics, something that I understand you have recently discovered. I ascribe to certain violent and irregular motions and unnatural postures of the body, by reason of which the natural structure of the vital machine is so impaired that serious diseases gradually develop therefrom. I wrote of repetitious work, repetitive trauma. The maladies that afflict the clerks arise from incessant movement of the hand and always in the same direction, causes intense fatigue of the hand and the whole arm because of the continuous and almost tonic strain on the muscles and tendons, which in course of time results in failure of power in the right hand. I also wrote of the dangers of sedentary work. They suffer from lumbago. They should be advised to take physical exercise, and at any rate on holidays, and wrote of the sit-stand desk. I understand this has become a popular media topic these days. I wrote of the importance of prevention, of controlling exposure to these hazards, of ergonomics, the importance of periods of rest, the need for exercise, and the need to change one's posture. If you choose to stand at any moment, please feel free. I wrote of the importance of ventilation and temperature control. I wrote of hand hygiene, something my friend from the Medical Center of Occupational and Occupational Health Centers understands is important these days. We've still not learned from Semmelweis, but we're getting there. I also talked about something which I understand your organization called OSHA has discussed just recently, and that is the need for medical removal from trade when certain conditions appear. And yes, my friend, occupational medicine in my days was misunderstood and disdained by mainstream medicine. I, unfortunately, was unique among my contemporaries in my sympathy for workers. Indeed, I brought bile to the noses of doctors whenever I talked to them of my need to visit workers, to see how they worked, the conditions which affected their health. And yes, I saw the influence of the profit motive and how it could influence the destruction of health. So, my friends, I have in this brief time carried you quickly through several millennia of the history of occupational medicine. I've taken you from thousands of years before the Common Era, when people performed do-it-yourself kind of personal protective equipment to protect themselves from the implements of war and hunting that they used. I told you about the military physicians, really the first occupational physicians, who were assigned to manage the trauma of the military. I told you about the surgical papyrus that was discovered in and how it wrote of the neurosurgical and orthopedic procedures. They did not do fusions then, I don't believe. Lumbar fusions are new to this age. I also told you of the beginnings of environmental medicine and how the Roman environmental engineers in the between 300 and 600 BCE used aqueducts and sewers to protect the public health of the citizens of Rome. I've introduced you again to Hippocrates and what he has implored all physicians to do if they are to practice medicine properly, and that is to understand the environment in which people live, the impact on their health, and the lifestyle and how important that is. I then brought you into this common era and told you of Pliny the Elder, of mining hazards, and his beginning use of the respirator. then told you of Galen's work in managing the health of those in the arena. And then in the late 1400s, when Ellenborg produced the first industrial hygiene manual, and then into the 1500s, as Paracelsus began to explore the relationship between toxicology and pharmacology and the importance of dose. And then in the 1500s, Agricola, who described in great detail mining hazards and introduced this concept of industrial hygiene, hierarchy of controls. In Stockhausen, talking of lead poisoning, and indeed ended with myself. Humbly, I say, but tell you today, yes, we knew about ergonomics. We knew about the toxicity of chemicals and how it affected people. We knew about occupational diseases and the importance of prevention, and we knew how profit destroyed health. Thank you, my friends.
Che buona lettura. Grazie per tutti. We have time, about 5 minutes for questions for our ghostly eminence, and then we'll ask Ivory to come back and introduce the second speaker. Questions for Il Dottore? Please, come to the microphone.
Just wondering, in your research between the 1st century to the 14th century, we have a big, is that part of the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages?
Yeah, I mean, this, as T said in the beginning, was, I had some general knowledge of this, but I really commend looking at the history and seeing the dark spots and seeing how wise actually the pioneers were. But yes, there have been many dark spots, and one could look more recently and think about dark spots actually in the history.
Following up on that, I mean, this was the Dark Ages in European history. There was hardly any written things, and then everything was burned, etc. So this is the Dark Ages. However, what we know is in these dark ages of the Western civilizations, there were bright civilizations in the Arab world and in China and the Middle East, including incredible doctors. So what I was wondering, is there a chapter, maybe it comes in the next session, a chapter where you talk about Arab
that's a very interesting point.
And
actually, is Bob
the Persians and Baghdad and China?
Yeah.
Did they have occupational medicine?
Yeah. Well, no, I think it's an excellent point. And indeed, this is a history of Western occupational medicine. So I don't know if it's.
I would defer to Paul on that. If anybody knows, you've got to know right here, Paul.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly your point is excellent. And there indeed is. I mean, I don't know very much about it, but I know a little bit about it. And there is a history that I did not explore.
Nicely done. It's clear you mentioned that physicians didn't buy into his concerns. Were there any employers who implemented his recommended control measures?
Well, I think what is true is that there was physicians were assigned to military units by the Romans. They absolutely were. And to some of the grand construction to deal. I don't think it was so much preventive, but it was mainly dealing with the trauma. But as I mentioned, labor was really very much considered disposable, and to a large degree, laborers were not considered part of society that physicians treated. Oh, I believe indeed. I know with the mining there was some because those are wonderful prints that are in the handouts prints of actual devices in mines. They're incredible. I mean, I don't know, you probably have the full set of 12 volumes, but they're beautiful prints of the controls. Actually, they're not photographs, obviously, but they're prints of the controls in place.
Good morning. In the modern era, we see an increasing emphasis on worker health in order to enhance productivity and profitability. Historically, was that a focus of Ramazzini, or was he more oriented towards the protection of health for the sake of health?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah, that's my understanding.
Buongiorno, dottore. A question for you in regards to occupational and environmental medicine. I know that Ramazzini was very much into the worker, but did he also delve into public health and the implications of working and diseases associated with that could translate to public health and safety?
I think he was really fascinated by occupations more than kind of community. I mean, he did. He alluded to Hippocrates. I mean, he understood the issues of environment, but I don't believe that was a. Yeah, please. And one other thing that's fascinating, he actually, after he wrote, the diseases of workers, he wrote a whole treatise on the health of nuns, actually, and was interested in this difference in terms of their lifestyle. So lifestyle and how it affected their health. But go ahead.
He also wrote an essay on malaria in the Veneto. So he was quite interested in public and environmental health. All right. We'll ask Ivory to come back up and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Blanc.
All right, so Dr. Blanc is a professor of medicine and holds the endowed chair in occupational and environmental medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where he has been on faculty since 1988. He received his BA from Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, where he first became interested in health and the environment, later training at the Harvard School of Public Health and Industrial Hygiene, the Albert Einstein School of Medicine, and Cook County Hospital in a joint occupational medicine and internal medicine residency. He was a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at UCSF from 1985 to 1987, and a Fulbright Senior Research Scholar at the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, thank you, in 1987 and 1988. In 2013 and 14, he was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. He has authored numerous scholarly publications in his field and is also the author of How Everyday Products Make People Sick. He also writes a blog, Household Hazards, that is hosted by the magazine Psychology Today. Dr. Blanc.
Thanks. How do Okay, now, is it down here somewhere? This? Slideshow. All right. Thanks for inviting me today. Thanks, T, for organizing. My goals today are to try to give you a conceptual framework in which you can highlight some major historical milestones in the period that I'm going to cover, and parallel with our previous speakers, show how the past can give us some insights to the present. Here's the conceptual framework I'd like you to wrap your arms around for this talk, which is that occupational environmental medicine is really the intersection of four things. Yes, it's biography, as we just heard, but more than that, it's also the intersection of economics, changing technologies, and also the history of ideas. And one, I think, striking thing about occupational environmental medicine history is that more than other aspects of history in the health sciences, it really shows the intersection of these various forces. Now, one of our challenges in our field, but in medicine and healthcare in general, is that the way history is seen is little more than little factoids that you can use to spice up a dull lecture. And also, often history is only used to show the supremacy of the new. That is to say, boy, look at what they used to think. And sometimes it devolves to an exercise in hagiography, perhaps overemphasizing the biographical. We also have to buck certain anti-historical trends. I think all of you have encountered this. If it's not in PubMed, it never happened. And if it was in PubMed after 2005, it's outdated. And if it's not in English, it has to be scientific. I don't know how many reviews I've seen where it's limited to the English language literature, which is a big mistake. So if we're looking at the period first, because I'm covering the Industrial Revolution up till 1900 in this talk, and that means that we have to start with the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. And at that time, technology can be thought of as mechanical devices, but also a period of new metals and alloys and an emerging global trade. In the history of ideas, this was the time in medicine when Galenism and the four humors was really on the wane, and there were two strong trends that were coming to the fore. One was iatromechanical concepts, which the new concept of the arterial circulation and is a prime but not the only example, and iatrochemical concepts, how chemistry worked in the body, and even the word gas as a concept emerged at this time. In economics, this is the time of a nascent military-industrial complex really emerging with the new manufacture of weaponry and of increasing urbanization. You've already heard in biographical terms about Ramazzini. I want to highlight one other person that you may not be aware of, and that's Evelyn. So this is the book you just heard about. And it's important just to contextualize about Ramazzini that there were things that he didn't talk about because he really limited himself almost exclusively to things he had some firsthand knowledge of. So, in fact, there's not a word in the book about coal mining because what did he know from coal mining in Italy in 1700? Although he did write a little bit about petroleum because they had some natural petroleum resources in Modena. There's nothing at all about cotton because cotton was an exotic. He wrote about linen, he wrote about wool. So he did talk about irritant inhalation. John Evelyn, who wrote the book Fumi Fugium in 1661, how many here have heard of John Evelyn? So this is the first book on air pollution, a treatise, and he was quite a flowerful writer. Whilst these are belching forth their sooty jaws, the city of London represents the face rather of Mount Etna, the court of Vulcan, Stromboli, or the suburbs of hell than an assembly of rational creatures. He was writing about coal smoke, which was really quite a problem even then in London. He was an interesting character in many ways. It's also important to note that in the 18th century, again on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, there were numerous translations of Ramazzini. He was translated into multiple languages, but also he influenced a lot of general medical texts, such as this sort of how-to self-help book, which I just give a sample here of the diseases of certain classes where he digests Ramazzini. They who work under, and adds to it because he talks here about coal pits. They who work underground in coal pits, mines, and company are commonly costive and look pale, etc., etc., etc. So as we come into full force into the Industrial Revolution on the history of technology front, this is the introduction of steam power, of mechanical looms, of the emerging chemical industry, beginning with the production of soda. I don't mean soda water either. And the introduction not only of fossil coal, but also the manufacture of coke from coal. In ideas, really this is when modern chemistry emerges, chemical concepts, Lavoisier and his colleagues. And at this point, there was the complete overthrow of Galenism. Galenism, which was waning in the years up until the Industrial Revolution, was really at this point dead in the water. The rights of man as a concept is emerging in this period. In economics, we have Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, We have the beginnings of the modern factory system, although it was going to come full-blown a little bit later, and early modern capitalism. And this period saw many, many annotators of Ramazzini, as I mentioned, and Thackeray's book, which was the first new book since Ramazzini, wholly devoted to occupational disease. And in toxicology, we also had an emerging discipline epitomized by Orfila in France. Just one example of the new chemical industry would be the emergence of chlorine, which was unknown as a substance before. In the bleaching industry in particular, this is where chlorine emerged. Before the discovery of chlorine, sulfuric acid was first used to shorten the bleaching process. In 1774, Scheele discovered chlorine gas, and very shortly after it was introduced into bleaching. By 1799, bleaching powder as we know it today was introduced, and then in 1850, Davy, as in the safety lamp, but this was other work of his, synthesized chlorine dioxide, which was to go on to become incredibly important in bleaching of a textile and of wood pulp. In terms of the occupational diseases which were emerging in the Industrial Revolution period, although Miner's thesis was well commented on in the centuries before, it was only in this period with the use of more mechanical tools that it really took off, and along with it a new disease, grinder's disease, which was huge in England in particular, and Sheffield. Cotton dust lung disease was first recognized in this period. Metal fume fever, which I'm going to come back to. Other organic dust diseases such as from flax in the linen industry, and something that was called shoddy worker's lung. Shoddy was just scrap waste of cloth that was recycled. Irritant gas inhalation was recognized, and these are all lung diseases of various sorts or inhalation-related diseases. But in terms of non-lung diseases, what came to be called the trade palsies were first introduced, and although Ramazzini may have talked a little bit about ergonomic hazards, our modern concept of peripheral nerve palsy was first described in the first part of the 19th century. Heavy metal poisoning was better characterized. Scurvy was recognized for what it was, and chimney sweeps cancer. There was a question about Asia and the technology. This is a description of zinc smelting, which I'm going to come back to in a few minutes, but this came to the West from the East. I mentioned Charles Thackeray. This was his book on the effects of the arts, trades, and professions, and in the second edition in 1832, the first edition was smaller and came out in 1831, he was the first to describe metal fume fever. He said the brass founders suffer from the inhalation of volatilized metal. The founding of yellow brass, in particular, in the founding of yellow brass, in particular, the evolution of oxide of zinc is very great. The brass smelters of Birmingham state their liability also to an intermittent fever, which they term the brass ague, which attacks them from once a month to once a year and leaves them in a state of great debility. Now, you may wonder, since brass was around since antiquity, why was it that this was never described before? And it's because until the British had metallic zinc that came via China and India originally, and learned how to create it, the method of making brass had a low zinc content, relatively speaking, and the process did not generate significant zinc oxide fume, which is why it was about 1800 or so that new method first started to cause metal fume fever. I mentioned chimney sweeps cancer. This was first recognized by Percival Pott in 1775. You can say that this was not really an industrial revolution caused disease because the technology was pretty primitive, but this is consistent with the changing dynamics of medicine that I think allowed this to be recognized. And one of the things that's underappreciated is that Pott realized that it wasn't unique to chimney sweeps. It was unique to their exposure, and others who had this exposure would have the same problem. There is a disease that's peculiar to a certain set of people, which has not, at least to my knowledge, been publicly noticed. I mean chimney sweeps cancer. It is a disease which always makes its first attack on and its appearance in the inferior part of the scrotum. The trade call it the suit wart. But he said other people have cancers of the same parts, it's just that chimney sweeps were more prone. And his son-in-law, who was Dr. Earle, who later published an anthology of his father-in-law's work, reported it in his own commentary on a gardener who came to St. Bartholomew's Hospital with a large cancerous sore occupying almost the whole of the back of his hand, and this patient had been engaged in scattering soot in a garden, and the hand was amputated. And this he wrote in 1808. A small footnote in a paper on this subject noted that the anatomical specimen of this hand that was amputated is still preserved in the museum at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. This is the hand. I actually wrote to the archivist, and they sent me this picture of it. So if any of you go to London, you can see this. Another interesting figure who's almost completely gone unrecognized is a physician named Scheffler, who worked in Central Europe. He was a contemporary of Pott's, and in 1770 he wrote a book on miners' health that in particular talked about the miners of Schneeberg and nearby Annaberg, because that's where he practiced medicine. And what was the changing technology there? It was that new metal, cobalt, had become lucrative, and because of that, it was mined rather extensively. It so happens that cobalt is found in natural geological association with uranium and therefore with radon gas. Nobody knew what that was, but Scheffler was a good describer, and he noted that among those who worked in these mines, there was a very early mortality, and very unlike miner's phthisis, or what we would think of today as pneumoconiosis, once you got the diagnosis of disease in this particular group of miners, you died very quickly. It was not a long process. And he recognized also that it had nothing to do with dust. In fact, he attributed this odd new disease to an inhaled gas or emanation, and he noted that it was high. The incidence was highest in a particular cobalt mine, and that mine was notable for very, very long and poorly ventilated galleries that the miners would have to go through to start work and come out of. So, very interesting. I mentioned already the Chinese technology of zinc, and this commentary by Thakra. I thought you'd find, since this is, I've been talking only about outside of the United States, here is a nice illustration of a piece of private currency. We didn't have national currency, of course, until after the Civil War, but this was one of the local currencies of the 1830s. And it was the Manual Labor Bank of Philadelphia. And the guy that owned the bank also owned a glass-making factory. So if you see here, the currency is illustrated. I don't know if I have a thing. It's illustrated with the workers in the glass factory. And this is sometimes referred to as the Elvis currency because this guy looks a little bit like. So 1840 to 1900 is a period in which the history of technology is marked by the growth of the railroads and of shipping, of the new organic dye industry, of steel making and metal plating in a modern sense, and in modern mining engineering. In the history of ideas, this is really the emergence of germ theory and experimental medicine in the modern concept. And not in medicine, but in social ideas, this is Spencerism or social Darwinism, if you will. In economics, this is the appearance of Karl Marx's Das Kapital, and also of organized labor in the modern sense. In the history of biography, you actually may not be familiar with most of these figures. Richardson, Greenough, and Simon are all British figures in public health and occupational health. Proust and Villermé are in France, and Hirt was the major German occupational writer of the time. Proust, by the way, was the father of Marcel, just of interest, was a public health physician and the man who came up with the term bisonosis. This is a typical picture of an industrial enterprise, a large-scale industrial enterprise of that period. In terms of work-related disease specifically, this is when the term pneumoconiosis was introduced, and as I just mentioned, bisonosis as part of those terminologies. Mill fever was described, which was an inhalation fever among cotton workers when they would come to the mills on Monday morning, and we now realize is related to high endotoxin. Chronic bronchitis in the dusty trades. Lung cancer in miners. Now, these are the same miners that Scheffler described, but we came to realize it was lung cancer. Wool sorter's disease, which we now call anthrax. And in terms of non-lung diseases, some other examples are chloracne, which was first described in 1899, aplastic anemia, which was first described from benzene, which was first described in about 1890, caisson workers' disease, which was rampant in the 1870s, carbon disulfide poisoning in the rubber industry, first described in the 1850s, and bladder cancer, which I'm going to return to. This is the time when occupational disease was starting to make its way into literature as well. And those of you who are fans of British Victorian literature, and Mrs. Gaskell is an author, might know the novel North and South, which also was made into a BBC series. In it, there's a poor working girl who's sort of minor figure, but the protagonist becomes close to her. She says, "I began to work in a carding room soon after, and the fluff got into my lungs and poisoned me." "Fluff?" said Margaret, who's the heroine of the book, inquiringly. "Fluff," repeated Betsy. "Little bits as fly off for the cotton when they're carding it, and they fill the air until it looks like all fine white dust, and they say it winds around the lungs and tightens them up. Anyhow, there's many a one as works in the carding room that falls into a waste, coughing and spitting blood because they're just poisoned by the fluff." "But can't it be helped?" asked Margaret. "I don't know. Some folk have a great wheel at one end of their carding rooms to make a draft to carrying off the dust, but that wheel costs a great deal of money, £500 or £600 maybe, and brings no profit. So it's but a few of the masters as we'll put them up." This is 1854. In the United States, in contrast, even though textile industry was huge here, there was a systematic denial that there was any cotton-related lung disease in the Americas, and that the problems in England and in France were because that was Europe, and in America we were immune to that. This is an illustration from the Lowell Offering, which was actually a magazine of the workers, but I've not been able to find anything about cotton dust-related hazards. I mentioned chronic bronchitis a little bit earlier, and the name Greenough, who is a great figure, wrote this book on chronic bronchitis, and in general, he wrote about it, but a big part of it was industrial causes, including wool sorting. And it's interesting that what he describes sounds as much like asthma as chronic bronchitis. Looking back at the Victorian era in the next century, in Edith Sitwell's biography, as it were, of Victoria, she writes eloquently, "What is this terrible sound as of multitudinous wooden shuttles, or air being driven through thousands of wooden tubes? What is this black cloud? What is this cloud of black dust expectorated from dying lungs? It is the sound and symptom of the industrial disease from which the grinders die." And again, grinders' disease, a form of silicosis, was huge in this period. This is also the period when the common working stiff starts to appear in fine art. Cailloux' painting of the floor scrapers was actually extremely controversial at the time, because the critique was that this is not the stuff of art. Why would you do that? So the attitudes that had been around for centuries were still persisting. I had alluded to the dye stuffs. It's worth going into this a little bit in detail, and I think this subject may come up again in the presentation, the second presentation in this series, or the third, I don't know what, but so one of the other speakers is going to be talking about it. In 1856, William Henry Perkins synthesized the first synthetic dye, aniline dye, mauveine, and he set up a commercial enterprise the next year, and within a couple of years, other dyes also emerged in the field. This was his factory on the left, and Queen Victoria was famous for wearing one of these synthetically dyed outfits very soon after it was commercially introduced. It's important to note that even for mauveine, this is not a single chemical moiety. It's really 4 different entities. It includes basic red 9, what we call it now today, rose aniline, magenta 2, and magenta 3. And there were multiple pathways that it could be synthesized from, including mercuric chloride using arsenous acid, and then a nitrobenzene synthetic pathway, which later became the dominant one. In the last decades of the 19th century, there was rapid expansion of the dye industry, and one of the most notable sites was the Huss Paint Works near Frankfurt. What was also happening in the history of technology was the invention of the cytoscope in 1878. And 10 years later, roughly, less than 10 years later, a surgeon who was quite into new technologies, Dr. Ludwig Renn, began practicing in Frankfurt. And in 1895, he described 3 cases of bladder cancer among 45 dye workers that he evaluated. And the only reason he could do that pre-mortem was because of this cytoscope, which he learned how to use. This was the paper in which he described this in 1895. Here's some more art for you, a painting of a marble polisher by Toulouse-Lautrec. Here is another example of the noble worker, something of a complete change of thought. This is an American example. Here is a photograph, the miner in repose, also not meant to be purely a documentary photograph, but really an art photograph. I want to return to Schneeberg that I had mentioned both for Scheffler in the 18th century and now by the 1880s. What they're wearing around their necks are miners' lamps, but these are not safety lamps. These are just a way of carrying a candle into the mines. And the miner's fountain is a statue that's there to this day. In 1878, a public health officer first noticed the increase in cancers of the lung, and a year later there was a more extensive report. This disease went on to become Schneeberger Krankheit, or Schneeberg's disease, and I think that the most remarkable thing is that in that period, nearly 1/4 of the miners were dying of lung cancer, a disease which was otherwise exceedingly rare because no one smoked cigarettes at this time. There was a lot of argument about what could be causing this. There was also confusion about the pathology. At one point, it was argued that arsenic must be the cause. These are some miners in America, just to break this up. Here's the major quicksilver mine in California, photographed by Carlton Watkins. Here's another American painting showing the nobility of the worker. This is the iron workers at noontime. And for those of you who want to return to literature, there's Émile Zola's novel of coal mining, Germinal, which has had considerable legs, including as a modern French film. I didn't want to leave air pollution altogether, having alluded to Evelyn in the 17th century. Here is Seurat's study for the bathers of Asnier, and what you can see is the factory pollution in the background, which actually is not in the final painting, but is in the study. And in terms of environmental disease, I think we're all familiar with the Great London Fog of 1950s, but in fact, in the 1880s, there were similar, very lethal London fogs, and this is just some biostatistics showing the increase in mortality rates coincident with that air pollution event. And it's argued, in fact, that Impressionist painting wasn't actually very impressionist when it came to these scenes of London, that this was more close to photorealism, and that air pollution in London was, which the French Impressionists would love to go and paint, was in fact a very important part of promoting the Impressionist technique. But it had earlier history below as an important early painting by Turner of factory pollution, and also shows how in his style it fit in. So to wind it up, we're now at the cusp of the new century, and this is when the first synthetic polymers were introduced. This is when power and electric tools began to be introduced, modern gas warfare, and in the history of ideas, the new public health, which really promoted bacterial contamination above any kind of chemical environmental contamination, Taylorism and the assembly line, the progressive era, and in economics we have the emergence of multinational corporations and cartels. And in terms of biography, Thomas Oliver, John Andrews, and Alice Hamilton, who our next speaker is going to be talking about more extensively. Here's a mill worker in 1908 by the photographer Louis Hine. And as we think about the first 2 decades of the 20th century and what kinds of occupational diseases were emerging, this is when asbestosis was first observed, although not yet named. We have the World War I gassing, which really changed how people thought about chemical inhalation illness. The airplane industry in World War I also put chemical hepatitis on the map. This was the first recognition of carbon disulfide disease in the rayon industry, although it had been recognized the century before in rubber work. And this is finally when radiation came to be understood to be the cause of the Schneeberger Krankheit. Just a couple of items on that. Of course, radium wasn't discovered until 1898, and very shortly thereafter, in 1905, radon was first measured in these mines. And it wasn't until 1921 that radon was proposed as the cause of the Schneeberger Krankheit. This is a stamp later on from Czechoslovakia. By the way, the mines on the Czech side of the border in Joachimsthal were every bit as contaminated as Schneeberg mines on the German side of the border, but the Austrian-Hungarian Empire basically suppressed any recognition of disease. So it wasn't until the Czech Republic, the Czechoslovakian Republic, was founded after World War I that radon-related lung cancer was first reported in those mines. And bladder cancer has a similar story of suppression. And just to end with a little bit of asbestos advertising for you, and noting that in the Oxford English Dictionary you can find when asbestosis first entered the English language. Here's John Singer Sargent's The Ghast. So I think I will summarize by saying that from the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, there were new exposures and diseases that were largely driven by emerging technologies and in some cases emerging diagnostic technology. Often early biomedical recognition was followed by contention and inaction, and really the appreciation of ambient environmental exposures ran in parallel. So bottom line, I think the history of occupational environmental medicine mirrors the wider history of ideas, and we should always take that into account. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I think we have time for one question. And if anyone would like to make their way to the microphone, let me also make one observation, and that is that you mentioned John Evelyn. Evelyn also, in addition to his contribution to recognizing air pollution, is also the founder of Sustainable Development. His book on forest management, in English, his book on forest management was actually one of the pillars of ecological sustainable yield, and as well as protecting the natural environment and the forest, and it really represented a major landmark in thinking in terms of sustainability. Yes, Brett.
Try to make the one question a good one. Thanks for the presentation. Did you find any incidences of where medical societies would take some of these different issues, these exposures that were raised by photographers, artists, and actually try to enact legislative changes or improvements in that? I didn't see where any medical society actually tried to take case reports and try to improve the situation.
Well, maybe I take the question in a larger framework, which would have to do with not taking it to courts, but let's think about public policy applications more generally, or legislative efforts. And in 19th century Britain, certainly there were very active parliamentary inquiries, and these did include medical personalities presenting information. So to that extent, it wasn't medical societies, but it was individual practitioners who would testify and would be active in trying to influence public policy, and that was part of the British public health agenda. Although it varied in time and by person, so that the granddaddy of the British movement in public health, for example, didn't actually have many concerns about occupational disease, but there were others.
Thank you so much, Paul. Ivori, you could come up and introduce our last speaker.
All right, so our last speaker is Dr. Gadati. He's an international consultant in occupational environmental medicine and sustainability. He had a 30-year academic career in the U.S. and Canada and is a recent Fulbright scholar. He has served as president of the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine, and in 2013 received the ACOEM highest award, the Knudsen Award. He is the editor of Archives of Environmental and Occupational Health, the author of the Prager Handbook of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, and the leader of a new initiative to document the history of occupational medicine in North America.
Well, thank you. This presentation is going to talk more about the institution of occupational medicine and its field of practice. I would first like to make a slight change in the disclosure, and that is that instead of no conflict of interest because I haven't written the book yet, we're now changing that to because we haven't written the book yet, because there is a book proposal under consideration, and it's turning into a group effort as opposed to any one individual. We have grown accustomed to the peculiarities of occupational medicine, but we really are a strange beast in the zoo of medicine. We, of course, and this is familiar to many of you, we have two sides. We have a clinical side and a population side. And occupational medicine is also better conceived as a health system than it is a single specialty or a field of practice, because we have primary care levels that do acute management. We have consultation levels that do more complicated issues, and we have tertiary referrals that do high-level cognitive work and program management on the population side, and so forth. So we really are better conceived as a comprehensive health system with multiple levels and with both population and clinical aspects. This is unusual. There really is not another field of medicine that looks quite like this, that has its own internalized pyramid. How did we get this way? Well, if we go back to some of the comments that Paul has made, I'd like to review some of the same time frame and discuss the eras, but with an emphasis on the social history more than the individual challenges in technology and healthcare. First of all, we're not accustomed to thinking of the United States as a developing country, but it most surely was. In the early 1800s, the United States was a capital-scarce developing country with a rather acute labor shortage. So with that economic framework, there had to be certain solutions. Unfortunately, the solution for initially was to try to enslave people. This is one of the dark sides of this country's history. First, the Aboriginal peoples, or Indians as we call them, they did not cooperate because they could easily escape, and so importation of African slaves, which was quickly abandoned in the Northeast, but continued in the Southeast for centuries. The United States was dependent on the United Kingdom for investment capital. The economy was heavily based on agriculture, particularly cotton, which was the major trading commodity displacing tobacco, and was really established the United States' position in the world in the early 18th century. Then, as manufacturing began to take root, agriculture diversified, the cities developed more capacity, and there was a little bit of innovation happening in the early 18th centuries that was different from the type of innovation in Europe. Export business, trade grew, mercantile trade with Europe, where we were doing more than buying all of our manufactured goods from England. We were actually exporting certain things, began to develop a more diversified economy. We should also point out that, like many developing countries today, the United States was really rampant in seizing intellectual property. If you look, for example, at the early medical textbooks that were in use in the early 19th century, most of them were British textbooks that were being reprinted without paying royalties to the author. So there's a whole long history here of intellectual property that we think of today with countries like China, but in fact, 200, 300 years ago, we had problems of our own in that regard. Technological innovation was mostly tweaking, refinements, making European ideas and technology a little more efficient and more adapted to the American context. But that rather quickly changed in the 18th century as the new United States began to develop its own intellectual footings and its own technological capacity. Cyrus McCormick was the first great inventor to develop an entire new industry of agricultural machinery. And with his true innovation and substantial changes in efficiency and in productivity were possible that were uniquely American. An exportable technology that allowed much greater agricultural efficiency and began the development of the United States as a technologically advanced and innovative country. By 1870, the U.S. was a world industrial power with an economy the size of Britain, which is a pretty remarkable achievement in such a short time. Part of its advantage was that it had such a huge internal market. Part of it is that the territory was so resource rich. The development of New York as a financial center gave a certain degree of independence and autonomy from London, which had previously been the source of capital for large-scale developments in the United States. And, of course, wars, which tremendously accelerated medical advances, unfortunately, particularly the Civil War. But the United States was finding its own niche in terms of technology and organization. And by 1950, largely because of the Second World War, the United States had displaced the United Kingdom and Germany as the dominant industrial power and economy in the world. And it did so partly by preserving the markets of the defeated nations. The Marshall Plan was a tremendous humanitarian move. It also preserved the economies of Germany and much of the rest of Europe for trade, and that accelerated the growth and diversification of the United States. Now let's turn the clock back and go back to the 19th century and look at how some of this played out in greater detail. As Paul has said, there wasn't much concern for workers' health. There is a grain of truth in the idea that workers were better off in the United States than in the UK at the time. Certainly, they had there was a longer average lifespan, but also workers in the United States were a more valuable commodity because there were fewer of them. As I mentioned, there was a labor shortage, and so that meant that workers needed to have greater job opportunities on the average, especially outside of the major cities, than they would have in the United Kingdom at the time. But the predominant attitude in that era was not for the health of workers physically, it was the concern for their morals. So if you look at the literature of the time, the preoccupation with the life of workers and how their working conditions had much more to do with alcohol, the abuse of opium, prostitution, and getting them to Sunday school on their one day of rest than it did the occupational health and safety. In the 19th century, in the early 19th century especially, it was argued that the United States was uniquely good in terms of its labor condition, and that there were many fewer risks than those seen in Europe. But in 1837, at the quite young age of 24, Benjamin Macready proved otherwise. He wrote a book called The Influence of Trades, Professions, and Occupations in the United States that still stands as a classic. It is not original in the same way that Thackeray's work was original, but it summarized information from a variety of sources and basically demonstrated that the United States did have a problem, and it was a big problem in terms of occupational health and safety. And after it was published, and it was even given an award by the American Public Health Association of the day, it was essentially completely ignored. This tended to happen over and over again in public health issues, but in Macready's case, it's particularly interesting the silence that followed the publication of his essay. In the meantime, occupational medicine, the delivery of services in the workplace, which was not, of course, known by that name at the time, was expanding greatly as the industrial enterprises expanded. As a practical matter, health care for workers was a necessity. So there were physicians associated with mines and railroads and military detachments as they moved into the West and so forth. And in the cities, increasingly to the more dangerous factories that were being built as the Industrial Revolution developed. But the emphasis was on treating injured workers after the injury occurred. There's very little emphasis on prevention. You could say in that sense that occupational medicine can be looked at as a protector of the worker, helping to maintain health, or as an enabler to allow industry to expand and move forward with dangerous technologies and into remote locations without adequately addressing the hazards. So you can look at this in two ways, and this is a major conundrum when you look at the role of occupational medicine in social history. There's no question that the provision of surgeons, particularly, and physicians allowed the expansion of what were then dangerous industries: railroads, mining, merchant marine service, chemical production, as Paul has outlined. And railroads, of course, were particularly critical in the development of both the American economy and our history in occupational medicine, because railroad surgery and the organizations that had to do with railroad physicians and surgeons were really the forerunner in the 19th century of modern occupational medicine. This is where this was the taproot, if you will, of our field back in the 19th century, and was responsible for developing entire healthcare systems. There are plenty of hospitals that still exist in the West, in the East, in the Midwest that began as hospitals associated with the railroads and part of networks. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a major social and economic crisis, and that had to do with capitalism and concept of worker exploitation, nested in much bigger issues that had to do with social justice and with equality. Paul mentioned the rights of man. This was a time when the counter-revolutions and when the Napoleon III was in France, and a lot of issues of the rights of man were being rolled back. So there was a great deal of frustration. Workers' rights were a part of that, and Germinal was part of that. 1848 was a critical year with revolutions breaking out all throughout Europe. But occupational health and safety was a relatively minor theme in all of this unrest compared to justice, social equality, and power, and whether or not a free enterprise society or a capitalist society, a communist or socialist society would be the better model. Communism as a model did not exist yet. However, there was a lot of talk about various models of socialism that would allow more responsibility on the part of producers and employers in meeting social objectives. But the revolution stopped at the water's edge. It didn't. Bits of it came in piecemeal into the United States, but the U.S. as a whole was relatively resistant to socialism. Part of this had to do with active resistance by employers, anti-union activities, and part of it by what Michael Harrington once said was the great reluctance of the United States to follow socialism was that every worker believed that he, in that sexist society, could break out and eventually get rich. Therefore, they weren't going to support the broader agenda that might exclude them. So the U.S. response to the revolution in Europe was reactionary, to grow ever more conservative. However, the contradictions in American society weren't resolved. There were still big inequities. The workplace was still very dangerous. There was a lot of problems that were accumulating. So there was, in fact, a social movement to address them. That began roughly 1880, and today, in retrospect, we call it the progressive era. And we associated with the American president who had the greatest interest in and influence on all this, which was Teddy Roosevelt. The agenda of the progressive era was quite broad. Included living conditions, economic justice, female enfranchisement, and but also included a lot of lifestyle issues like birth control, which unfortunately morphed into eugenics. Whole series of issues there that we don't have time to get involved in. But it was a time of muckraking, of identifying social problems, of proposing solutions, and particularly one movement stood out as a community-based movement to address these problems, and that was the settlement movement. The settlement movement was an effort to intervene at the community level by bringing immigrants, by bringing American residents or American-born residents who were impoverished into a network that would support them, their families, that would advise them on how to solve problems, and selectively use charitable influence to make their lives better. The settlement influence the settlement movement began here in Chicago, and its leading advocate and organizer was Jane Addams. Jane Addams is worth an entire day symposium on her own. We don't have time to talk about her many, many contributions, but we do have time to talk about one of her best-known students and proteges, and that protege was Alice Hamilton. I am a bit distressed at this meeting that we seem to be ignoring Alice Hamilton, but she really should be front and center in the celebration of our centennial. She was born into a very privileged life in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but like so many occupational physicians, she transcended that privilege and went to medical school, and then entered a field that brought her into contact with real working people. Her career as a toxicologist and as an occupational physician started with lead. She had an early achievement in documenting the extent and the severity of lead poisoning in industry. And then, and I think that this really is quite remarkable, she took the lead industry and instead of just saying, well, we've got to control lead, she turned it into a generalizable model for occupational health protection. In terms of regulation, in terms of hygiene, and so forth. And she used this model to address other similar problems, such as phosphorus, and show that the risk can be reduced. She was a remarkable one. And I strongly recommend her biography. I'm having a senior moment here. Endangered trades, exactly. And copies are available for purchase at this meeting, and I would strongly suggest that you read it. It's a remarkable book, and it also shows a great deal of depth of concern for other social issues that as a direct result of her work, we can say that we now have an occupational medicine which is transformed from the previous railroad medicine emphasis. The field of industrial hygiene began really with her work in the United States. The regulation, the first laws that are based on toxicology for the regulation of chemical hazards, stem largely from her work. She established government-based laboratories for occupational hygiene in Illinois and Massachusetts. She extended the progressive tradition of social change to occupational health in this country. And she was the first woman on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. That's a remarkable achievement for one person, and I think that a lot of it was because she had a very engaging manner, very disarming manner, and she worked not through confrontation but through cooperation and persuasion. Workers' compensation, we simply don't have time to get into because it's a specialized topic of its own, but it came to the United States as an adaptation of a German model, and the significance for occupational medicine I would give for you, in addition to providing yet another venue or arena to look at occupational injury and disease, it also provided a payment mechanism that was separate from the kinds of fee-for-service reimbursement that physicians were getting in general health care, and ended up playing a major role, shaping role in occupational medicine later. The second major figure in this era that we have to salute as one of our most illustrious predecessors is Harry Edgar Mock. Harry Mock was just an extraordinary person. He was actually the founder, the first president of the American Association of Industrial Physicians and Surgeons, and we were organized, our group was organized in his office here in Chicago in 1916. He was a surgeon based here in Chicago. He was medical director of the Sears Roebuck Company. And those of you who have seen the movie Rosenwald will be aware of just how progressive Sears Roebuck was under the CEO Julius Rosenberg at the time, Rosenwald at the time. And it really played a major role in advancing the progressive agenda. Harry Mock was Rosenwald's medical director. He established the teaching model that we use, teaching through occupational medicine clinics. He started the first one at Rush Medical School, and he wrote an extraordinary book called Industrial Medicine and Surgery that was very forward-looking and very sophisticated. He talked about occupational hazards. He talked about wellness. He talked about community interventions. He talked about the workers and productivity and the economics of occupational health protection, and also the ethics of occupational health protection. Extraordinary figure, and he deserves much more time than we have available to discuss him. The progressive era ran until a little before World War I. That was the era of the horrible, tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that in which 146 largely immigrant sweatshop workers were killed in a terrible fire in which the owners had intentionally locked the doors to keep them in. It had a galvanizing effect, shocking effect on New York and to a lesser degree the rest of the country. Led to fire codes, led to commissions that the future Governor Al Smith chaired that developed occupational health and safety laws and made New York state a model for the rest of the country in developing state laws, because the state had responsibility for occupational health at that time. Most states largely ignored it. New York was the model for those states that wanted to do something. In World War I, it suddenly became apparent that the majority of recruits were in terrible shape, that Americans in general were malnourished, they were out of shape, they were unfit, and they made poor soldiers. The screening programs that we have for were modeled largely on tuberculosis screening in the military. Fitness for duty was largely modeled on screening recruits, and it was considered a national disgrace how badly American recruits were faring in terms of their medical evaluation. And this stimulated a great deal of research in work physiology, in fatigue studies, and occupational surveillance. The issue of war gas and inhalation hazards is important for another reason besides that Paul mentioned in terms of raising awareness. It also was the beginning of the time-weighted average. So the idea that concentration time the concentration time product creates a constant which can be used to predict toxicity, which is the basis of our threshold limit values and our PELs today, came from German research on toxic gases, which arose from this era. And of course, we now know that time-weighted averages are approximate at best, and that generalization, however useful, is actually toxicologically very weak. The 1920s were dominated by clinical practice, by screening methods, by medical standards for so-called pre-employment evaluations, and trying to get the healthiest workers and to screen out tuberculosis, which was rampant, of course, in those days. Animal-based toxicology was used to set standards, and there was even some human experimentation. The American Association of Industrial Physicians and Surgeons transformed into the Industrial Medical Association and eventually became ACOEM. The critical event in that period was a tragedy that occurred a little bit earlier in 1919. The American automotive industry had been hampered by the poor quality of gasoline in those days. In order to create a more evenly burning fuel, they had to create an additive that changed the combustion characteristics, and the one that was the cheapest to use, not necessarily the best, was tetraethyl lead. There was a tragedy in which over 300 workers had severe irreversible neurotoxicity as a result of their exposure to tetraethyl lead, and 20 some odd died in the Ethyl Corporation, which was set up in order to produce this material. Partly on the basis of that, the automotive manufacturers and the oil companies contracted with a toxicologist at the University of Cincinnati by the name of Robert Kehoe. Kehoe went on to an illustrious career and established the Kettering Laboratories at the University of Cincinnati, but his legacy will always be debated because he was very he believed that the risks of lead had actually been overstated even back in those days, and we can trace back our current 40 micrograms per deciliter standard to his disbelief that lead was as acute a hazard as it was reputed to be. He also generalized and thought that lead was not a severe hazard to young children. He advocated looser standards and blocked standards whenever possible by testifying at congressional committees. So his legacy is very mixed. He also was a secretive individual. He didn't share reports, and he was known behind the scenes to block the work of other individuals. So Robert Kehoe has a very mixed legacy and represents one of the cautionary tales that it's very important for us to be aware of, lest issues like that recur in the future. We have also had our successes in that era, though. The iron lung, for example, which later became invaluable around polio, was a direct adaptation of respiratory protection and work physiology that was done originally for occupational health protection. I'm going to run slightly over here, and for that I apologize. In the 1930s, of course, was the Depression. It was a crisis for the capitalist system. There were a whole series of setbacks, but the worldwide depression resulted in an economic standstill. People were happy just to have a job. Occupational health was not a priority because people were desperate for any job. Wages were falling. Occupational health standards were secondary to getting any job. Occupational physicians were laid off during the Depression. There were relatively few of them were retained by industry. But, and we had the Hawk's Nest disaster, which was, to date, still the worst occupational health disaster in U.S. history. It was an incident involving tunneling through virtually pure silica rock that led to the deaths of thousands of poor, largely black workers in West Virginia as a consequence of completely inadequate dust suppression. Frances Perkins emerges as the leading figure in this era. She was the Secretary of Labor. She developed the first federal rule on occupational health and safety, established the Division of Labor Standards, was very active in trying to counter and reduce the risk of silicosis, very incompletely, because, as you know, it's only been just a couple of weeks since the silica standard was revised. She also introduced Social Security, the minimum wage, and regulated work hours, all in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, and was very supportive of state divisions of industrial medicine. So Frances Perkins is the third person that we credit today. Not much time to go into great detail here, but during wartime, necessity is the mother of invention. The occupational medicine revived during this period. It came back as a major force during the Second World War because of the need for fitness for duty, because the defense industries were often hazardous. There was a military certification system to try to recognize physicians who had special expertise in this era, but there had been a decade of neglect, so that was not so easy. New healthcare models were coming out of occupational medicine, like Kaiser, which began as an occupational health service. But there was also a problem, and that was emerging conflict with general practitioners. General practitioners saw occupational medicine as a distinct threat, because if the employer provided health services, then there would be less for the community general practitioners. Also, an important event occurred in 1948, and that was the well-known Denora air pollution episode. Here was the crossover point between environmental medicine and occupational medicine, because the first response to Denora was to send out U.S. Public Health Service scientists who actually had the training and equipment from occupational health assessment in order to establish what was going on environmentally in this first air pollution episode. I'll just go very briefly that in 1945, the Truman proposal for a national health insurance plan was opposed by the American Medical Association. This put, but the American Medical Association went a step further. They, at the time, they were dominated by general practitioners who were opposed to the so-called, quote, corporate practice of medicine. The corporate practice of medicine today means non-physicians owning services that employ physicians to provide health care. Back then, it was essentially any provision of care that was not single physician fee-for-service medicine. We were denounced as unethical in that era, and the American Medical Association was pretty powerful in those days and very much marginalized occupational medicine and our predecessors. It also set up a competing council called the Council on Occupational Health, which itself did good work, but which duplicated the Industrial Medical Association of the day. So in summary, there are deep connections between occupational medicine and other social issues. Ours is really a social history, not a medical history, really. Modern occupational medicine arose from successive social movements, like the progressive movement. We change through social awareness and technological change. We don't change that much through advances in medicine. Improved conditions in the workplace often follow tragedy. And whatever our current relationships, and they're much better now, of course, there's a long history here of occupational medicine being quite intentionally held back because it represented a threat to other medical areas. But traditionally, we've been a source of innovation well beyond our own field of occupational medicine. And I'm going to end by just putting this slide up on the, because this session was canceled in the program. Here are 10 specific areas in which occupational medicine has made an intellectual contribution to medicine and public health in general, going far beyond our dealing with specific occupational problems, such as the concepts of asthma and irritation, which largely came from PEEPs, and the recognition of inflammation as being a critical component of asthma, as opposed to bronchoconstriction per se, in the 1950s and 60s. That arose from occupational medicine and toxicology, not from the mainstream of respiratory medicine. So I think that it's fair for us to take credit for that. And many of these other advances in medicine as a whole came out of things that our predecessors did that were occupationally related. So I'm sorry I've gone over here, and I'll be around for questions. And thank you very much for your attention. We're now well into our break.